Okay, let's dive into a really big and kind of under the radar change to the rules for America's biggest banks. It's a fascinating story about a crucial balancing act. How do you keep the financial system safe without, accidentally breaking it?
So we're going to start with a bit of a paradox. A key rule, one that was created after the 2008 financial crisis to make everything safer, was somehow creating a huge problem in the single most important financial market in the world, the market for U.S. government debt. How is that even possible? Well, let's dig in.
This whole story, it's about a rule with a really complicated name, but a super important job. That rule is the Enhanced Supplementary Leverage Ratio, or eSLR for short. Now, this thing was designed to be a simple, blunt instrument. Think of it like a concrete floor. It didn't care about all the fancy, complicated risk math the banks were doing. The eSLR just said, look, you have to have at least this much capital set aside compared to your total size, period. It was meant to be a powerful backstop to stop banks from taking on way too much debt or leverage.
But what happens when that safety floor suddenly starts acting more like a ceiling? Let's take a look at how this simple backstop turned into what a lot of people started calling a straitjacket.
So here's the fundamental difference you've got to understand. Most bank capital rules are risk-based. They're smart, they're nuanced. A risky loan to a company, that needs a lot of capital. An ultra-safe U.S. Treasury bond, that needs almost none. But the eSLR, it's different on purpose. It's risk-blind. To the eSLR, that Treasury bond and that risky loan look exactly the same.
And this is where things started to get weird. After 2020, with all the government stimulus and central bank actions, a tidal wave of cash and U.S. Treasuries flooded into the system. And the biggest banks, well, they had to soak it all up. But here's the problem. Remember that simple risk-blind eSLR rule? It just doesn't care that these are the safest assets on planet Earth. All it sees is a bigger balance sheet, which, according to its simple math, demands more and more capital. And you can see the result right here, clear as day. For behemoths like JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, and Morgan Stanley, that simple eSLR backstop, not their smarter risk-based rules, suddenly became the binding constraint. It was now the main thing holding them back, forcing them to hold just as much capital for a super-safe Treasury bond as they would for something much, much riskier.
This created a really bizarre and frankly a dangerous incentive. I mean, think about it from the bank's perspective. If you have to set aside the same amount of expensive capital for a safe, low-profit Treasury as you do for a risky, high-profit loan, which one are you going to want more of? The rule was actually pushing banks away from doing their essential, boring, low-risk job of supporting the U.S. government debt market.
Okay, so this problem got so big and the consequences so worrying that in November of 2025, regulators finally decided they had to step in and do something. They announced a major overhaul of the rule. So what was the big change? Well, they decided to move away from that rigid, one-size-fits-all number. Instead of a flat 5% or 6%, the new requirement is now tied to each bank's own unique systemic risk score. So, in theory, this makes the rule a little bit smarter, a little more tailored to each individual bank.
Now, at the very top level, the big holding companies that own the banks, regulators figured this change would cut their total required capital by about $13 billion. Okay, that's a lot of money, for sure, but in the grand scheme of things for these giant banks, it's not a world-changing number.
And this is the really big deal. The story is completely different when you look at the actual banks themselves. You know, the subsidiaries that are FDIC insured, where you and I keep our money. There, the impact was way, way bigger. A reduction of around $219 billion in required capital. And this massive difference is right at the heart of this whole debate.
Supporters of this change, as you can imagine, said this was a smart fix, that it was long overdue and absolutely necessary to fix a rule that was doing more harm than good. Let's look at their side of the argument.
And you can hear that argument perfectly in this quote from the FDIC's acting chair, Travis Hill. Basically, he's saying, hey, all we're doing is putting this rule back where it belongs. The goal is for the eSLR to be a safety net, a backstop, not the main event that's driving all the decisions.
So the case for the change really boils down to this. It's a smart, technical fix. The idea is that it lets the more sophisticated risk-based rules do their job again. It encourages banks to get back into the Treasury market, it gets rid of that weird incentive to chase risk, and it brings the U.S. more in line with the rest of the world. And proponents will stress that since a lot of that capital is just moving from the bank subsidiary up to the parent company, the system as a whole isn't really any less safe.
But as you can imagine, not everyone was on board. Not by a long shot. The critics, and that includes some people inside the Federal Reserve, warned this could have some really dangerous consequences.
and the pushback was pretty fierce. Take this quote from Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. She basically says, okay, I get the change for the big parent company, but I'm really worried about that massive $219 billion capital reduction at the actual bank level. The part that's backed by federal deposit insurance.
So the critics, they see this in a totally different light. They see it as a huge and dangerous step backward from the safeguards we put in place after 2008. They argue there's absolutely no guarantee that banks will use this extra breathing room to support the Treasury market. They could just use it for stock buybacks. And most importantly, they see a thinner safety cushion at the insured banks, which puts the taxpayer-backed deposit insurance fund at greater risk.
Okay, so we've been deep in the weeds of bank capital ratios. You might be wondering, why on earth should I care about any of this?
Well, it matters a ton, because the health of the U.S. Treasury market, that's like the foundation for the entire global financial house. The interest rates on U.S. government debt influence the rates you pay on your mortgage, your car loan, your credit card, everything. So having a stable, well-functioning market is absolutely crucial, and this rule was seen as clogging up the plumbing.
This change didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It's really just the latest chapter in this long back-and-forth tug-of-war over financial regulation that started way back with the Dodd-Frank Act. We saw the rule get made, then relaxed during the pandemic, then debated all over again after the regional bank failures in 2023. It's just this constant search for that perfect balance between safety and efficiency.
And that leaves us with the big, multi-trillion-dollar question. This change is a really significant swing of the regulatory pendulum back towards more flexibility. So, is it a smart, overdue correction, like its supporters say, or is it a dangerous gamble, like the critics fear? Well, only time is going to tell if regulators have finally found a right balance or if they've just set the stage for the next great test of our financial system.